Snow burned my knees as I knelt on the sidewalk outside the diner. Neon Merry Christmas light pooling over a small brown puppy, shivering on the ice while wind chill could stop her heart. His fur was soaked, his ribs sharp, and no one else slowed, though lifting him meant breaking rules he'd hidden behind for years. I felt his tiny body flicker in my arms, like a second chance I might not take. But before that frozen sidewalk, life in our small town was so gentle, I almost missed the first soft cries. The week before Christmas, our little town hospital felt like a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. Flakes and people drifting in slow, restless loops. I stepped out the staff entrance into air so sharp it burned my lungs, planning only to cross the lot to my car. Then I heard it. A thin, broken whimper threading through the hum of generators. So soft it could have been imagination. I turned toward the sound. Boots sliding on black ice, dusted with powdered sugar snow. By the dumpsters, an overturned trash can, spilled coffee grounds, and crumpled cups like dark confetti. Tiny pawprints stitched wild circles through the slush, overlapping, then shooting off toward the side street. Whatever had made them was gone. A delivery truck rumbled past, headlights bleaching everything flat, making the lot look briefly stage-lit and unreal. That night at home, steam curled from my mug as I stood by the apartment window, porch light throwing a weak cone onto the alley below. A neighbour's television leaked canned laughter and sleigh bells through thin walls. Somewhere down there, a dog barked once, sharp and high. Then again, nearer. The sound cut off as if someone had closed a door. The empty rooms behind me seemed to lean in, listening with me. The next morning, an email pinged every staff inbox. Reminder: do not feed or shelter stray animals on hospital grounds. Contact security or animal control. The subject line carried a little red exclamation point like a raised eyebrow. I read it twice, coffee cooling in my hand, the memory of that fragile whimper rising again. The message wasn't addressed to me by name, but it felt uncomfortably close, like someone had been watching my thoughts. On my lunch break, I cut through the side corridor toward the staff entrance, intending only to grab something from my car. There, under the metal bench, a small brown shape was tucked tight, paws curled under, fur slicked with melted snow dripping from boots. His eyes tracked every movement, body tensed to bolt. I knelt slowly, extending my hand, but before I could utter a word, the automatic doors hissed open. An orderly pushed through, laughing too loudly into his phone, wheeling a rattling cart piled with linens. The clatter echoed off the concrete. In a heartbeat, the puppy shot out, nails skittering on wet pavement, disappearing behind a parked SUV. My fingertips touched only cold air. The orderly glanced at me, then at the retreating blur, and shrugged as if stray lives were simply background noise in December. That evening, I pulled down an old box of decorations, dust puffing into the kitchen light. Beneath a tangle of tinsel lay Daisy's chipped blue-rimmed dog bowl from my parents' farmhouse, the glaze worn thin where her tag had tapped for years. Id carried it through the divorce, through my mother's illness, to this small apartment, then never filled it. My thumb traced the worn initials scratched into the side while the radio murmured a storm warning. Later, walking through the town square, I watched couples drift beneath twinkling lights and plastic reindeer, breath clouding in tiny puffs. Near the edge of lamplight, the same small dog hovered behind a pair carrying shopping bags, shadowing their path at a careful distance. They never turned. He never barked. When I paused, he did too, ears pricked in my direction. Then a car turned the corner, headlights flaring, and he vanished into the darker space between buildings. The unease followed me home like a draft that wouldn't seal. 2 mornings later, the car radio hummed with a cheerful voice, warning of a Christmas cold snap, the kind that broke pipes and records in one sweep. I let the engine idle while I scraped frost from the windshield, breath fogging the glass. Out of the corner of my eye, a small shape slipped between parked vehicles at the edge of the hospital lot, pausing whenever someone passed, then melting back into shadow. At the bus stop by the pharmacy, I saw him again. He stood just outside the loose circle of commuters, tail low, head tilted as though listening for a name he'd never learned. A man dropped a candy wrapper. The pup flinched, then inched closer, nose twitching at the smell of sugar. When the bus hissed up, doors yawning open, he backed away from the rush of feet, choosing cold air over crowded warmth he wasn't invited into. On the medical floor, Mrs. Henson waved me closer with surprisingly strong fingers. She whispered that she'd seen a little ghost dog in the ambulance bay during the night, white breath curling by the glass. Her oxygen cannula bobbed as she chuckled. Insisting head stared up at her window like he recognized her sorrow. Later, when I slipped outside to check, only faint paw smudges marked the frost by the door, like hurried punctuation. After my shift, I wrapped half my sandwich in napkins and carried it to the sheltered corner near the loading dock. The wind sliced through my scrubs and coat, making my eyes water. I set the food down by the warm exhaust vent, feeling ridiculous and tender at once. Hours later, when I checked, the napkins were shredded, the bread gone, and a set of tiny wet paw prints marched away toward town, each step slightly deeper than the last. I almost mentioned the dog to Carl from security when I passed his desk, but the laminated policy poster behind him caught my eye. No pets in apartments without prior approval. My lease echoed the same words. Underlined. I pictured muddy paws on my tidy rug. Chewed cables. Landlord's frown. Then the memory of that small body under the bench rose up like a quiet objection, and the excuses in my head suddenly felt thin. In the staff lounge, the evening news played, volume low. The local shelter director, bundled in a worn parka, spoke earnestly into the camera about being over capacity. A scrolling caption at the bottom begged people not to abandon pets before the holidays, warning of fines and court dates. Behind her, kennel after kennel held pairs of eyes pressed to chain link. I imagined the little brown dog behind those bars, mislabeled, unwanted, and my stomach knotted. At choir rehearsal, in the church basement, someone joked about a stray mutt hanging around the outdoor nativity scene, looking holier than the plastic sheet. Laughter rippled through the folding chairs. Hymnals thunking softly as pages turned. During break, I stepped outside into snowflakes spinning under the floodlights. By the wooden manger, only shallow paw dents remained, already softening under new powder, like a sentence partially erased. Walking home along Maple Street, I finally saw him clearly. He stood under a street lamp, not 10 feet away, ribs sharp beneath muddy fur, ears too big for his narrow head. He didn't run this time. I sank into a crouch, knees protesting, and held out my hand, palm up. His eyes, too old for his size, met mine with a question I felt more than heard. Where do you belong when no one has written your name down? The high, thin thread of that question wrapped itself around my own life and pulled tight. 2 winters before that Christmas. My first holiday after the divorce and my mother's diagnosis. I had taken every extra shift offered. The hospital's fluorescent corridors, with their beeping monitors and predictable chaos, felt safer than the quiet apartment that echoed with what-ifs. A sympathy card from the church sat unopened on my counter, its cursive name visible through the thin envelope like someone calling from behind frosted glass. For years, when life grew too jagged, Id escaped to my parents' farmhouse on the hill outside town. Daisy, our old collie mix, would ride in the back seat, shedding enough fur to knit a sweater, her head occasionally nudging my shoulder at red lights. She had a way of planting herself in front of you when you tried hardest not to feel. Head tilted, eyes steady, tapping her tail patiently until you gave in and told the truth. One December afternoon, long before Noel appeared, a pile-up on the interstate had shredded the day. We worked through twisted metal and broken glass under a sky the colour of dirty wool. One young driver didn't make it, despite everything we threw at the void. Later, in the dim med room, A therapy dog padded in with his handler, resting his head heavily against my knee. Hot tears slid into his fur before I even realized I was crying. When my mother passed, the farmhouse had to be sold to cover expenses. A real estate letter arrived with glossy photos, a new coat of paint, fresh shutters, no porch swing. Daisy had already died by then, buried under the maple tree behind the barn. I packed the few things that still smelled faintly of home, including her chipped blue bowl. In my small apartment, I placed it on a shelf like a promise I didn't yet understand. One pale spring evening, months before I met Noel, I walked the river trail after a brutal shift. A thin dog nosed at the reeds, coat patchy, tail tucked. I tossed half a granola bar toward him, promising myself he'd call the shelter when I got home. But by the time I reached my front door, my mind had moved on to patient charts, dinner, bills. I never made the call. I never saw that dog again. That failure sat somewhere behind my ribs, quietly waiting. The summer before Noel, a stalled storm cell dumped inches of rain on Maple Ridge in a few hours. Sirens wailed as basements flooded. A neighbour boy got trapped behind a jammed back door. The volunteer rescue team arrived with a big shepherd K9, the dog shouldering through dark water to lead them in. By morning, everyone knew that dog's name, told and retold over grocery carts and coffee refills. That image fur slicked with rain, muscles straining against current. Jaw set on something beyond fear hung around longer than the headlines. It lodged next to memories of Daisy and that therapy dog in the med room, forming a quiet thread through my understanding of how animals slip into the cracks of human disaster embraced there, holding us up in ways we rarely deserve. When the hospital administrator later invited a therapy dog program to pilot at Maple Ridge, I volunteered to walk patients with a mellow golden retriever. I watched faces soften and shoulders unclench under the gentle weight of a paw. Stories spilled out in low voices, war memories, lost spouses, estranged children. Each visit felt like someone had cracked open a window in a long-sealed room. One evening, the application packet for a permanent therapy dog partner lay half completed on my kitchen table. Name, schedule, responsibilities, all easy. The line asking whether I could offer a stable home stopped my pen. I stared at it until the letters blurred. Outside, across the alley, a dog barked at nothing in particular. I set the form aside, telling myself I wasn't ready to rearrange my life for another living. Needy heart. I told myself there would be time. Now, as the little stray's pawprints began to intersect with my daily routes, that old half-finished form and that nameless river dog returned in sharper focus. It felt less like coincidence and more like a question folding back on itself. How many chances does a person get to choose differently before the world simply stops asking? 2 days before Christmas. The forecast stopped sounding like a suggestion and more like a warning. My phone chimed with alerts about Arctic air barreling south, wind chills that could burn skin in minutes. In the ward, patients instinctively pulled blankets higher, and staff moved a bit faster between rooms, as if we could outrun the cold pressing itself against the brick. On my way to work, I ducked into the discount store near the bus stop to warm up. My feet carried me down the pet aisle almost on their own. My fingers closed around a flimsy fleece blanket printed with cartoon bones and a small bag of kibble. At the register, the cashier raised her brows. "For your dog?" she asked. "For now," I said, the truth sitting oddly in my mouth. Later, during a rare lull, I heard soft scratching above the rumble of generators and the clatter of rolling carts. It seemed to come from the ambulance bay door. Curiosity tugging, I slipped my stethoscope from my neck and pushed through the heavy door into the brittle air. Breath blooming white in front of me, like test film smoke. There, under the bumper of an idle ambulance, crouched the puppy. His paws were pink and raw against the salted concrete, fur clumped into icy spikes that stuck out at awkward angles. He watched me, wary but too exhausted to run yet. I crouched slowly, wincing at the cold seeping through my knees, and held out a piece of my granola bar. Palm up, voice low and steady. He inched forward, each step cautious, nose working furiously. His ribs expanded in shallow, hesitant breaths. Just as his tongue brushed the crumbs, the automatic doors behind me sighed open and an EMT rolled a gurney out. Wheels squeaking, metal rattling. The sudden noise snapped the tenuous thread between us. The pup bolted, a streak of brown fear disappearing behind the line of vehicles. The granola fell to the ground, untouched. On my break, I carried the fleece blanket to the loading dock, tucking it into the most sheltered corner I could find, near a warm exhaust vent humming steadily. I set out a metal bowl of water and poured a neat circle of kibble. On the wall above, I taped a handwritten note asking security to leave the setup if possible, for the stray too cold to be choosy. It felt like signing my name to a feeling it'd been trying to hide. That evening, the volunteer coordinator called, voice frayed, asking if I could help at the church basement dinner. They were short on hands, and the weather was scaring some volunteers off. I hesitated, picturing quiet and laundry, then heard myself agreeing. On the walk over, I scanned every alley and doorway, my eyes automatically searching for a small shape against the snow-dusted sidewalks. In the basement, folding chairs scraped and kids lined up with plastic plates for turkey and instant potatoes. A couple of leashed dogs dozed under tables, their people absently stroking soft ears while swapping stories about grandkids and old hunting trips. Something in my chest pinched at how naturally those hands found fur without thinking, while the little stray outside had no such anchor. Leaving the church, I stepped into sleep that stung my cheeks. Headlights swept the street, turning wet asphalt into a smeared mirror. Across the way, near the pharmacy trash can, a small figure nosed at a split garbage bag, tugging at a styrofoam box. For a moment, the light framed him perfectly thin flank, oversized ears, tail twitching with a stubborn will to live. Our eyes met across the street, and something inside me stepped forward before my boots did. The decision was still unspoken, but it had already started forming. Christmas night settled over Maple Ridge with a brittle stillness, the kind that made every sound travel farther. Most porch lights glowed, but windows were curtained. Families folded inward around tables and televisions. In the ER, a fall on icy church steps kept us later than scheduled, a hip fracture that refused to respect the holiday. By the time we finished, the red digits on the clock had slid well past dinner time. As I clocked out, my phone buzzed with another alert. Temperatures well below zero. Wind chills worse. Authorities urged people to bring pets inside. Check on neighbours. Stay home if possible. I thought of the fleece nest at the loading dock, imagined it stiffening into a frozen lump under a sky that had turned hard and glassy. Guilt rose like bile, hot against the cold air seeping under the back door. Outside, the parking lot sat under a thin crust of new snow. The little camp Id made was ruffled, the bowl overturned, kibble scattered like tiny stones. Pawprints circled in tight, frantic loops around the blanket, then veered away toward the street, fading where the plough had passed. The sight felt like arriving late to an exam and finding the doors already locked. I wrapped my scarf over my nose and started toward downtown, boots crunching in the brittle crust. The only business still open was the diner, its soft Merry Christmas neon sign bleeding red and green into the swirling flakes. The light pulled onto the sidewalk, warm and inviting, making the darkness beyond seem even more unforgiving, like a stage where someone had forgotten to cue the actors. Halfway there, something dark lay slumped against the curb, just beyond the neon's edge. At first glance, it looked like a fallen trash bag or a dropped coat. Then it shuddered, barely, a tremor that moved through the small shape like a last argument with the cold. As I drew closer, details sharpened painfully. Mud-matted fur crusted with ice, ribs rising in shallow jerks, eyes open but unfocused. Snow gathered along his spine, each flake sticking to the dampness and refusing to melt. His paws were tucked under his body, as if Head tried to make himself disappear into the concrete. The world moved around him in muted motion. A couple hurrying past with leftovers. A teenager laughing into his phone. A man carrying a foil-wrapped pie. They stepped wider around us without looking down, as if sorrow were contagious. I let my work bag drop, the thud muffled by snow, and sank to my knees on the frozen sidewalk. Cold shot through denim and bone. Up close, his breath rattled faintly in his chest, a fragile, uneven metronome. My gloved hand hovered above his side, terrified that too much pressure would crush something that might still be coaxed back. "Hey," I whispered, unsure whether I wanted him to wake or simply not die alone. Inside the diner, silhouettes shifted as faces turned toward the window. The waitress cracked the door open. A gust of warmth and the smell of frying onions spilling out around her. Conversation dimmed. "You okay out there?" she called. Voice edged with concern and something like dread. The jingle of the doorbells sounded too cheerful against the sight at my feet. "I need something dry," I managed. "A towel, blanket, anything." She looked past me, really seeing him now, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh Lord," she breathed, then vanished back inside. The door swung shut, and for a brief, suspended moment, it was just me, the blowing snow, the neon halo, and this little life flickering between my arms like a candle in a draught. She returned with a faded Christmas dish towel and a thin coffee-stained apron. Apology in her eyes. I wrapped the cloth around his chest and tucked the apron around his paws, feeling the faintest tremor of response. Inside my head, rules and policies lined up like scolding voices. No pets in my building. Hospital infection control. Liability. Outside my head, his shallow breaths kept counting down. Snow thickened, blurring footprints, muting the world. The puppy's gaze drifted from my face to the blurry stretch of street beyond, as if some part of him expected to keep moving, to keep searching for a doorway that would open. In that moment, I saw every time it looked away from pain in my patients, from my own loneliness, from that river dog years ago. The weight of all those choices settled heavily, and I understood with terrifying clarity. If I stood up and walked away now, this would become a story I wouldn't be able to live with. Before I could talk myself out of it, I slid my arms carefully beneath his small body. He weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones, damp fur, and cold that seeped straight into my chest. As I lifted, he gave a thin, startled whine, head lolling against my shoulder. The shock of his icy coat soaking my scrubs drew a gasp from me, but my grip tightened automatically, like it'd done this my entire life. The diner door flew open as I approached, bells jangling wildly. Warm air surged around us, thick with the smells of coffee, gravy, and cinnamon. Conversations faltered, then faded. A family in the corner booth paused mid-prayer. The father's hand hovering over joined fingers. The little girl turned fully in her seat, eyes enormous as they followed the dripping bundle in my arms. Inside, the puppy tucked his nose under my chin, breaths shallow but present, each one a small defiance against the cold that had nearly claimed him. Up close, he smelled of wet cardboard and old fear. But beneath that, faintly, the sharper scent of something new. A possibility. "Oh, sweetheart," the waitress whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. Someone pulled a chair aside so I could rest him briefly on the vinyl seat. She reached for the phone, saying, "Shed call animal control," her voice trying to sound practical. "They'll know what to do." She offered gently, the image of him waiting in a metal cage, cooling down again while paperwork shuffled, flashed through my mind. "It's Christmas night," I said, hearing the urgency in my own tone. "Roads are bad. The shelter's full. I work at the hospital. We have warming blankets, equipment. If someone can drive us, it'll stay with him." A trucker at the counter, halfway through his pie, set his fork down and wiped his mouth with a napkin. "I'm headed past the hospital anyway," he said, voice steady. "No fuss. No reason to sit here while that pup decides whether to keep breathing." Chairs scraped as he stood, a quiet agreement passing through the room like a nod. In that small public stage, my private decision became a shared responsibility. Minutes later, we were in his pickup, heater roaring, windshield wipers smearing sleet into streaks. The dash glowed a soft blue. I cradled the pup against my chest, feeling each shuddering inhale as if my own lungs had shrunk to match his. The driver kept his eyes on the road, but spoke into the space between us. "Got a dog at home," he said. "Found her behind a truck stop dumpster. Best bad decision I ever made." At the emergency entrance, fluorescent lights washed everything in harsh clarity. Snow clung to my hair and shoulders as I stepped inside. The charge nurse looked up from her chart, eyes landing first on my face, then dropping to the bundle in my arms. "Claire," she began carefully, "we can't just bring stray animals into patient areas. Infection control will have our heads." Her tone held rules and worry in equal measure. Before I could answer, an elderly patient on a gurney near the nurse's station lifted a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the puppy's dangling paw, a faint smile softening the lines of his face. "Let the lady try," he rasped, voice thin yet firm. "If that little fella made it this far in this cold, seems to me he's already passed inspection." A chuckle rippled through the nearby staff, diffusing some of the tension. We created a makeshift nest on an unused rolling cart in a corner, away from patient rooms, but within sight. Warming blankets cocooned his body, and a couple of warmed IV bags, wrapped in towels, were tucked gently around his sides like improvised hot water bottles. The puppy didn't resist, only watched me with hazy eyes as we worked, his gaze tracking my hands as if memorizing their pattern. A tech called in a favour, and within an hour, a local veterinary nurse in holiday print scrubs stepped through the sliding doors, cheeks pink from the cold. Staff drifted closer, forming a loose circle of soft voices and concerned eyes. It felt less like breaking protocol and more like a community quietly bending rules around a single sinking star, trying to hold it up. She checked his temperature, frowned, then listened to his heart with practiced care. "Hair's dangerously cold," she said, "but young, and there's still good tone here. If we can get him through tonight, he has a real chance." She scanned for a microchip and found none. Only a faint, flattened line in the fur where a collar once might have rubbed. When the temporary custody form appeared, my pen hovered only a moment before moving. Seeing my signature under responsible party felt like watching someone else jump off a cliff had been standing on for years. Just before dawn, in the bluish hospital quiet, I sat in a plastic chair beside the cart, both of us wrapped in warmed blankets. His breathing had deepened from ragged gasps to slow, regular pulls. When I shifted my hand, his tail thumped once against the blanket, then again, soft but purposeful. His eyes met mine, clearer now, and in that small, steady look I felt the title of our story settle into place. No one had noticed, until I did, and now I could not unknow him. By late January, the mountains of snow lining Maple Ridge sidewalks had shrunk into grey, stubborn piles. The worst of the cold had loosened its grip. The puppy, now officially Noel according to the paperwork on my fridge, had filled out, fur grown soft over once prominent bones. His paws no longer bled from salt. They pattered confidently across my kitchen floor each morning as he did a quick inventory of his new kingdom. My landlord came by to inspect a leaky radiator and stopped short when Noel trotted into the hallway. Ears perked. His brows drew together. I slid the letter from the hospital across the table official letterhead. Formal language about therapy dog candidate in training and community benefit. He read it slowly, then sighed. No barking after 10, he muttered at last, though his hand briefly dipped to scratch Noel's head on his way out. Lines move. Sometimes our mornings fell into a comforting pattern. Noel nudged my elbow at the alarm, then waited while I laced my boots, head tilted, as if reviewing the day's itinerary. We walked past the diner where we first stepped into each other's story. The Merry Christmas neon still glowed, now less flickery. The waitress would lean out the takeout window when she saw us, sliding Noel a small piece of bacon and telling him had become her favourite Christmas tale to retell. At the hospital, clearance finally came through for supervised pet visits. On assigned days, Noel trotted beside me wearing a small blue vest that looked both slightly silly and entirely right on his sturdy little frame. He seemed to sense which rooms needed him most, drifting toward the quietest patients, those who watched the doorway but rarely called out, laying his head gently on the bedrail until a hand reached out to meet him. One rainy afternoon, the hospital hosted a community talk in the lobby on coping with holiday loneliness. Chairs were set in uneven rows. A folding sign announced the topic. I found myself at the front with Noel at my side, telling the story of a freezing Christmas night and a decision made on numbed knees under neon light. Faces in the small crowd softened as they listened. Noel curled against a boy's wheelchair, anchoring him quietly to the circle. Afterward, an older widower lingered by the door, hat twisting in his hands. He confessed, eyes on the floor. That head walked past the diner that night too, shoulders hunched, thinking only of his own empty house. Didn't see a thing but my feet, he admitted hoarsely. Noel ambled over and leaned his weight against the man's leg, tail swishing slowly. The man's hand sank into fur, his shoulders lowering a fraction. Second chances, I realized, sometimes arrived as forgiveness you hadn't asked for. Evenings at home grew predictably warm. Tea steamed in mismatched mugs. The television murmured low news, and Noel sprawled across my feet like a weighted blanket, sighing contentedly. On particularly windy nights, when the windows rattled and old anxieties tried to climb back in through familiar cracks, my hand would find his fur without thinking. The sharp loneliness that once echoed in my living room had faded to something quieter, like background music you no longer needed to turn off. One afternoon in early spring, the therapy program coordinator handed me a laminated badge with Noel's photo and his new title. Facility Support Dog, Trainee. His ears looked comically large in the picture. We attended a training session at the community centre gym, where kids, seniors, and a handful of skeptical staff watched as dogs walked obstacle courses and practiced calm greetings. Noel glanced back at me occasionally, checking in, then moved forward with a little extra confidence each time I nodded. By the time next December loomed on the calendar, our days had braided together into a rhythm so natural I could hardly remember what my routines had been before him. Still, whenever we passed that patch of sidewalk under the diner's sign, I felt a quiet shiver of recognition. The public moment where strangers had watched me scoop a half-frozen life off the street had rippled outward, turning into a dozen smaller, gentler moments, patients smiling, neighbours stopping to talk, me choosing not to walk past small needs. The town had changed in tiny ways, and so had I. A year later, Christmas Eve arrived on softer feet. Snow fell in unhurried spirals, drifting around Maple Ridge's modest decorations. Noel and I walked the familiar route from the hospital toward downtown, his leash loose between us, our breaths puffing in tandem and then disappearing into the pale sky. The cold nipped, but it no longer felt like an enemy waiting outside the door. We paused beneath the diner's Merry Christmas sign, now repaired so its glow held steady, bathing the sidewalk in warm red and green. I looked down at the exact spot where I had once knelt, knees burning, unsure whether this little life could be saved or whether I had the right to try. Noel sat beside me now, solid and bright-eyed, tail sweeping slow arcs across the snow-dusted concrete as if claiming the ground as part of his story. Across the street, a teenager shrugged off his jacket to wrap it around a shivering cat perched on a stoop. He glanced up, catching me watching, and flushed. I just smiled and nodded, recognizing that small, private pivot when a person decides to kneel instead of keep walking. You never know which quiet choices will echo, who will be watching from a window or a corner table, who will carry the story forward. Back home, the porch light cast a gentle circle on the weathered boards. Noel circled his bed twice before settling with his head resting on my foot, the weight familiar and comforting. The town beyond our thin walls hummed with muffled gatherings, clinking dishes, distant carols. The sharp ache of old empty holidays had been sanded down into something steadier, like the reliable ticking of my mother's old kitchen clock now hanging above my stove. I threaded my fingers through Noel's fur, feeling the warmth that had once been nearly extinguished on a frozen sidewalk. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the town in a fresh, forgiving layer. Inside, his breathing rose and fell in an easy rhythm that my own heart had learned to match. I'm glad we found each other. I'm not alone anymore, I said into the quiet room. Noel's tail thumped once in answer, and the truth of those words settled around us like a blanket we would share for all the winters still to come. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.